Good morning, class. Please be seated. Today, we are going to discuss two very important, very intrinsically linked incidents in Japanese history for our inauguration recording of Mom's history lessons in ASMR. First, the expedition by Commodore Matthew Perry, also known as the Black Ship Incident. How many here are familiar with the Black Ships and Commodore Perry? Oh, that is all right. This is not something widely taught outside of Japan. Commodore Perry, in the year 1853, was sent to Japan. He was sent there under orders of President Millard Fillmore in an attempt to open trade and relations with the Tokugawa shogunate, the Bakufu. Now, the Bakufu, for over 200 years, had maintained a very strict policy of isolation. Nobody in, nobody out. If, for whatever reason, you were able to leave, you were never, ever allowed to return. This did not matter who you were. You could have been a minister, a commoner, samurai, merchant, it did not matter. Foreign traders were only allowed to ply their wares at an island offshore, and then those wares were transported to the mainland. Foreigners of Boshin were not permitted to set foot on mainland Japan. Commodore Perry had two primary orders with his expedition. The first was to open up economic ties with the nation of Japan. The second was to establish a base of operations for American whaling ships to refuel, resupply, and care for anyone injured. On January 8th of 1853, Commodore Perry and his brand new steamships, referred to in Japan as the Black Ships because their hulls were covered in tar, sailed into the waters of Japan, Edo Bay in particular, which at the time, which is modern day Tokyo, at the time was still referred to as Edo, and proceeded to turn their guns toward the shoreline and open up with a volley. Now, you may be thinking, but Mom, I thought this was supposed to open up diplomatic relations, not attack. Well, those cannons were not actually loaded with cannonballs. This was both a very elaborate display of American power and a celebration of the 4th of July. Now, mind you, this was 4 days after the 4th of July, but they were in the middle of the Pacific at the time. They had just reached Edo Bay. That was the excuse given, though, as we can all imagine. The real reason was because Commodore Perry wanted to show in no uncertain terms just how powerful the United States Navy was. And so he then contacted representatives of the Bakufu, which again is the proper title for the Tokugawa shogunate, or just any shogunate government. We refer to the Bakufu typically as the last shogunate government. When referring to Bakufus, you generally mean the Tokugawa Bakufu, or the Tokugawa shogunate. However, it is not simply the Tokugawa. Previous ones were also referred to as the Bakufu. Commodore Perry presented the representatives with two things: a letter from President Fillmore requesting, and I say requesting in the loosest sense, that Japan open its borders for trade with the United States, as well as a place for American whaling ships to refuel, resupply, and tend to their wounded. The second was a white flag, essentially saying in no uncertain terms, should you decide not to acquiesce to our demands, you may need this flag when we proceed to kick the fuck out of you. The goal after that was to eventually establish diplomatic relations. America and European nations had seen, after the First Opium War, that Asia was more or less just open for whomever wanted to come and claim it. Now, the shogunate, being not insane, not stupid, and not trying to destroy the country, in the most sensible response they could have had, said, all right, we will open up trade. We will allow you to resupply. However, this seems reasonable to us, and honestly seemed reasonable to most people at the time. But there was a group within the disaffected part of the samurai class, what would have been referred to primarily as the Western daimyo, or the Western nobles, but later became referred to as the Southern daimyo, or the Southern nobles. The reason they were referred to as the West is because maps of Japan had Japan sitting horizontally rather than vertically. So everything was either east or west rather than north and south, insofar as Japanese reckoning was concerned at the time. Now, with that, these daimyo, who were part of a faction that did not really like where things were heading with the Tokugawa in general, felt this was the perfect opportunity for them to go ahead and make their play to overthrow the Bakufu. They felt that, well, the shogun is nominally the one in charge, but the actual power rests with the emperor. They thought to themselves, why is it that we are not hearing the emperor's voice on this? What does the emperor have to say? Well, come to find out, shortly thereafter, the emperor was not terribly pleased with the situation either. The emperor rather disliked it. The emperor was very, very against the idea of just opening up without a fight, without anything. Now, how much of this was the political machinations of the emperor trying to restore himself to power, and how much of it was the emperor genuinely felt that way. We may never know. But one must understand the emperor and the entirety of the nation did view outside influences, particularly that of the West, as barbarians, regardless of the technological gap betwixt the two. It was not something that was unknown that Japan had fallen behind, shall we say, technologically from where things were. We were still using the Tanegashima, which was a very well made weapon, but it was still just barely more than an arquebus. The Americans came to our shores with rifles. Now, for those unfamiliar with the difference between a long gun like a musket and a long gun like a rifle, the term rifle does not just refer to any gun that you need two hands and is longer than a pistol. Rifles refer to a weapon with rifling, which is a spiraling inside of a barrel of a gun. Now, technically, most any weapon can be referred to that way because of the rifling, which is the term for the spiral in the gun. That spiral makes it where when you fire a round, the bullet twists. That spinning makes it more accurate. Rifles are vastly superior weapons to your standard musket, muzzle, or breech loading because that spinning, again, makes it far more accurate. And rifling was added to a great many things cannons, there were long guns, pistols, all manner of things. And it gave a distinct edge over weapons that were not rifled. So, of course, the standard issue weapon that the U.S. Navy and Marines came to shore with were going to be vastly superior to the Tanegashima, regardless of how superior the quality of the manufacturing of Tanegashima was. Again, Tanegashima is a catch-all term rather than something that is more specific. The reason being, the weapons produced in Japan at the time, the guns produced in Japan, were referred to collectively as the Tanegashima because the region of Japan where the muskets were first manufactured by the Japanese rather than imported or purchased from foreign traders was Tanegashima. So all weapons of that sort became referred to as Tanegashima. To further demonstrate the technological gap betwixt the two nations, Commodore Perry was instructed to present the shogun with a series of gifts. Rifles, as we said, rifles, infinitely more accurate than the Tanegashima at the time. A couple of Colt revolvers, which that is an amazing gift. If you have not ever seen or held one of those, they are a work of art, truly. A telegraph system. It was two ends of a telegraph, one to send and receive, the other to send and receive back to the first. But it allowed them to show the Japanese that we can communicate across vast distances instantly. We may take such things today for granted, but in 1853, This may as well have been magic. And then a model of a locomotive, a train, a model train, again, to demonstrate the technological prowess of the United States. I like to believe that the shogun and the emperor saw this train and were like, we have to get us some of this. Because if you are unfamiliar, the Japanese love trains. We adore trains. So thank you, Commodore Perry, for helping us love trains. Circling back, though, to the daimyo that were less than pleased with the situation, that wanted to restore the emperor to his rightful place because, again, remember, regardless of the fact that the shogun literally ruled, the power to rule rested with the emperor and the imperial household because going all the way back, all the way back to the very beginning of things, the only way one could be a shogun, which the shogun was not even the military ruler, just think of this shogun starting out as like the highest ranking general of the army. He runs the army in the day to day, but he has issued orders from the emperor. Just that is what the shogun was. Just like the president will issue orders to the highest ranking generals and admirals of the Navy, the Air Force, and so on, the Army. But the day to day is managed by them and then their subordinates, not the president. But over time, this changed to where the emperor became ceremonial, the shogun became the literal ruler. But to be shogun, one had to prove a familial link to the imperial household because the first shogun, again, the plural of shogun is not shoguns, it's shogun. The plural, so the first shogun, and yes, it will become confusing. I will clarify, shogun in this case being plural, were all members of the imperial household, branch families typically, or a possible heir 2 or 3 sons down the line. It was never going to inherit, but did need something to do with his life. We've discussed such things on stream where you have your primary heir, your heir apparent, the crown prince or crown princess, whichever the case may be, and then subsequent children, subsequent heirs, are often given more martial training to have them fulfill a role in the military because they need something to do, something to feel as if they are of use, lest they rise up and make things difficult for their siblings. So, to give a bit more clarification, the Tokugawa link to the imperial household was generously, at best, tenuous. This is something that was known but never really spoken about because what are you going to do? Speak out about this in front when the shogun can just have you killed because he did not like what you said? But this did give rise, as I said, to the disaffected samurai clans in the south, beginning a movement called Sonojoi. Sonojoi is Japanese for revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, which absolutely has the most amazing posters for anything I have ever seen. Their marketing was fantastic. So, if you have never seen it, the posters for Sono Joy were a sumo wrestler tossing a United States Marine onto his ass in the typical samurai throw that you see where they do this sort of rotating the body. They'll take hold of somebody and using centrifugal force throw them. That is their poster. It is absolutely fantastic. I love it. Now, this is essentially where Harry's story ends as so far as anything with this. Yes, he was there and in the background a little, but not terribly prevalent as far as the movers and shakers of this particular situation we're moving into, which is referred to as the Boshin War, which was the last Japanese Civil War. Honestly, it did not even last that long. So tensions were rising. Again, this all took place in starting in 1853. 1853, Perry landed, did his thing, did not expect an answer right away, so he left and continued on his mission to China. Commodore Perry and his fleet did go to China. They established some trading there, what they were told to do by President Fillmore at the time. They came back in 1854 for their answer, which the answer they were given is, yes, we will go ahead and sign off on this. We will go ahead and open up trade. We'll establish all these things. From 1854 up until the start of the Boshin War, which was in 1868, tensions were rising. Political players were moving their chess pieces about. The shogun had died. Then the son he had been preparing to take over also died. I believe he lasted about 5 months before he just died, and that was it. So now we have a succession crisis to top off everything else going on, all the civil unrest because of the Perry expedition and the disaffected groups of samurai. The groups, in this case, the Satsuma, the Choshu, and the Tosa domains. These were the groups of samurai. There were also court nobles involved. The court nobles, though, they are sort of important. This is mostly about the samurai. But these three domains were biding their time, gathering their strength, purchasing weapons. Funnily enough, despite the activities that they were engaging in with the population, which is other people saying, hey, we need to get rid of the barbarians. We need to absolutely remove all of them from our nation. They do not belong here. They, with both hands, embraced every single aspect they could of Western civilization that gave them a military edge. The hypocrisy of humans is always so amusing, and you see it throughout history. It will be a recurring theme we see in subsequent lessons. Are we all following along this for our class? Good. So, let us continue. The Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa gathered all of the guns, ammunition, everything that they could. They purchased steamships. They learned to fight like a modern Western nation. They were hiring British commanders to teach them how to fight. They were hiring former British Navy officers to teach them how to sail. Now, you may be thinking, but Professor Oscar, Japan is an island nation. Would they not already be a substantial navy because they're an island? I mean, England was always a naval power for most of its modern life because it is an island and it has to express power somehow. Normally, you would be correct, yes. Island nations generally tend towards a powerful navy because they have to express their power via sea rather than via land. However, you must also remember that Japan predominantly fought itself. Rare were the instances where Japan would attack another place. The Japanese have almost always fought the Japanese. It is a reason that we are so good at combat. War is what we do. We may not be that way or come across that way now, but as a people, that is something that is deeply ingrained into us. You must also remember, of all the nations that have ever fought the United States, Japan is the only one that has really given it any pause. So they had to learn how to manage a navy. And who else but the British? The British were the most powerful navy on the planet. They were the superpower of the day. So, of course, one would be a fool to not reach out to the biggest, baddest player on the block to learn how to do things just like them. During this time, this, shall we say, gap between the Black Ships incident and the start of the Boshin War, there was the occasional conflict. The city of Kyoto was constantly having some manner of conflict, bloodshed, battles. There was every day something was happening there. And this is where a lot of this started, actually, was in Kyoto, because that was where the emperor was. And to control the emperor, to have the emperor in your possession, gave your side, whichever your side was, imperial or shogunate, it gave you legitimacy. We will get to that shortly with a very interesting thing, which this always amuses me. This particular battle always something I found amusing. But prior to the actual outbreak of war, the Choshu would attack, the Satsuma would attack, the Tosa not as much. They were as not as involved in the conflict immediately. They came and leveled their military strength when hostilities fully opened. A lot of the pre-Ocean War combat and incidents were instigated by the Choshu. The Choshu are very angry. They were not happy with much of anything that was going on here. The imperial faction during this time made several attempts to rescue the emperor, shall we say. A little more than kidnap, but is it truly kidnapping if the person you were trying to get hold of wants you to take them? So, the Choshu, the Satsuma, the Tosa, we'll call them, again, the imperial faction, the imperialists, they made several attempts to attack and claim the emperor, or attack the imperial palace, to take hold of the emperor, to take custody of him. Now, shortly before the outbreak of the war, the emperor at the time, Emperor Kome, had died. Now, this allowed his son, who became known as Emperor Meiji, to take over, and he was definitely more sided with the imperialist faction. Now, you may think, well, of course he would be. He was the emperor. Certainly he would want to have his power restored. Well, you would think that. However, generally, the imperial household was content just letting the shogunate do shogunate things. But Meiji saw another way. Meiji absolutely wanted to be the one who was in charge. He wanted to have everything under his control rather than under the control of the Tokugawa. His father, though, Kume, again, had died. He died in 1866. This was around the time where the Tokugawa shogun at the time had died. Now, if you recall, I said that there were two candidates for shogun after the shogun, at the start of all this, the father had died, and then his heir apparent had died, his crown prince, as it were. Well, the two younger ones, one was an adult, the other was still a child, I believe. If I recall, he was something along the age of 12. The 12-year-old was put in the position where he had taken control. Although he was little more than a puppet, he was entirely under the control of ministers who wanted to see the ways and technology of the West come into Japan to strengthen the power of the shogunate. At this time, for the next 2 years, because remember, the war did not start until 1868, became essentially an arms race, but not so much only military growth. This was a race to become a modern nation, a modern everything, not simply a modern military, but a modern political power, a modern infrastructure, a modern way of doing everything. The side that modernized and prepared first would be in a better position to rule, were they to be the victor. So, the actual outbreak of this war began at what is called the Battle of Tobafushimi. Now, at this battle, the sides were effectively wielding more or less the same sort of weapons. The Imperial faction, however, had a bit more of everything because they were focused more on not trying to maintain power, but to maintain a military strength because they were not the ones in power. They did not have to worry about tamping down on any disobedience from the citizenry or unrest or anything like that. They had more time, more ability to prepare themselves for war. They also had that training we discussed from the British. Now, while the Imperial factions went to the British for their training, the shogunate enlisted the aid of the French. Those that are unfamiliar may think, oh, that is a silly idea. Why would you enlist the French? Everybody knows the French surrender. Prior to World War II, France was the least nation you wanted to fuck with. You did not want to have anything to do with going to war with France because France would put you in the trash can. They were the land power everyone was terrified of. So who better than the shogunate's mind to train their army than the most powerful land military on the planet? However, it would seem that those lessons from the French, the shogunate did not take to heart. Because while the shogunate forces were much larger, because remember, this was the government. They did have the army. They were the military. They had fought with the imperial forces, who they outnumbered considerably. But they did not win because the imperial forces, they had better training. They took more of their training to heart. Another thing too, that this, if you are not familiar with this particular time or just samurai in general, the regions, domains, whatever you like to refer to them as, Aosetsu and Shoshu, have far more militaristic and martial leanings than most of the other domains that were run by samurai or that were run by the government directly. Their martial history tended toward giving them a leg up against others because war was, again, what they did more than anyone else. Now, when you think of samurai, you think of men charging across the field on horseback or on foot, armor protecting them with that very unique style of helmets with horns and flint mail and the like, running gloriously into the other side, katana glinting in the sun. That was the samurai during the time of the Sengoku Jidai, the civil war that led to the establishment of the Tokugawa Bakufu. Samurai of this time period were basically bureaucrats with swords. Yes, they still practiced swordsmanship, They still practiced how to fight, how to do the traditional things samurai did. But as with many things at the time, it was ceremonial. It was a thing they did because it was expected of them, not because they did it practically. The Satsuma and the Choshu in particular, this was not simply, oh, we do this because it is the thing we do, and our class is expected to do this. No, this was what they did because this is what they did. They never stopped being the samurai you think of when you think of samurai. But this battle against the smaller, yet better organized and better armed imperial forces fighting the larger shogunate army at Tokufushimi, which was outside of Kyoto, was the start of the Boshin War. This led to several smaller skirmishes before the siege of Edo began. The leader of the imperial forces at the time, a man named Takamori Saigo, marched from Kyoto to Edo. Now, when he got there, you might think, well, Edo, the capital of the shogunate, obviously this is going to be the battle to end all battles. This is going to be death and destruction, bodies raining from the sky. No, Edo was surrendered almost without a single shot being fired. Negotiations began. Saigo was able to negotiate a surrender of the city with nobody dying. Now, that was simply Battle of Edo itself, which we say battle. It was more of Saigo's forces coming to the door and saying, hey, give us all of your stuff. And that happening. Afterward, we have the Battle of Ueno, which this is in Edo as well. However, this was more or less one of the last holdouts of the city. While the majority of Edo was surrendered bloodlessly, pieces of it still decided they were going to resist to the very end. And with this, you had the Imperial Army, which about 10, 15,000 soldiers against a few thousand of the shogunate soldiers. There's about 2,500 Tokugawa. They fortified themselves within a temple. Now, for quite a while, because they were fortified within this temple, they were able to hold off the imperial forces until, and once again, we have Tofu rearing its head. Because again, what must remember, class, Tofu is very much a mercenary. War is more than any other what they do. The Choshi forces were able to come up and flank the fortifications and get in. They were able to do so. Existence of, and we've not seen them much yet, but here they come. The Tosa. The Tosa were exceptionally skilled at gunnery. They became the siege masters of the day. They were the ones with the heavy cannon, breaking fortifications, bombarding strongholds, and sieges, and they were very good at it. So back to discuss a very amusing story within the first battle, the opening battle of the Boshin War. So, when the Emperor Meiji had been rescued, kidnapped, whatever you would like to call it, taken by the Imperial forces, this was still a time where both sides were and could honestly declare that they were fighting in the best interest of the Emperor. They were fighting for the Emperor, for his well being, for the well being of the country, because at the time, the Emperor was thought of as the country, that what is good for the Emperor is good for the country. So both sides were able to claim that high ground in the conflict, saying, no, we are fighting for the Emperor. We are the Emperor's hand in this. We are the ones that want what is best for the Emperor, and we are the ones that are here fighting for his wishes and his desires. However, in this battle, and this is something I've always found particularly amusing, the Imperial battle standard was raised by the Imperial forces. Now, this may seem like something, oh, well, of course it was. Are you doing that? They would not. The reason being is this standard can only be raised, may only be used with the express consent and direction of the Emperor himself. Only when the Emperor says, yes, use my battle standard, could this be done. Now, when this did happen, the Imperial faction were the ones that raised the battle standard. When the Shogunate loyalists saw this, many of them faltered. Some even jumped ship and sided with the Imperialists because they genuinely were trying to fight for the Emperor. And everyone knew the side that has the standard is the side that is the voice and arm of the Emperor. Now, when the Tokugawa forces were routed here and they were retreating, domains, castles, other loyalist groups that they would have been able to call upon for assistance opened their doors to them because word had gotten out that the Imperial standard was raised by the Imperial faction. And these people did not want to side against the Emperor, as nobody wanted to outright say they were not for the Emperor. We have several more skirmishes, smaller battles, and many terrible losses for the Tokugawa, which is not to say they always lost. There were many battles and skirmishes that the Imperialists lost as well. Mostly, though, those were naval engagements. And the most important one, which led to the establishment of a small, for effectively 10 minutes until the Imperialists came and crushed it, was the Battle of Miyako Bay. Tokugawa, and this is generally something that was not done, but, you know, it happens from time to time. Unofficially, of course. Officially, military advisors are never involved in the conflict. But unofficially, well, things happen. The Battle of Miyako Bay. The Tokugawa, along with a couple of their French advisors, because their naval and military advisors were the French, were able to sneak on board the Imperial ironclad, because this is a time where ships were made out of metal now. Gone were the days of the completely wooden ship. No, our ships now are made of metal, referred to as ironclads. You may be familiar with this term if you have any familiarity with the American Civil War. But the Imperial ironclad warship, named the Kotetsu, was boarded by the Tokugawa and their French advisors unofficially. This never happened, they were never there. Now, they were not able to take the ship, but they destroyed considerable amounts of it. They killed most of the crew. However, they were not able to seize it. This was a pretty significant loss for the Imperialists. The Imperialists had to actually retreat from the battle. So, once all of the dust had settled here, we have the Battle of Aizu. One of the final battles. Aizu is a city in the north of Japan. It was one of the major strongholds of the shogunate. Late in 1868, the Tokugawa had, shall we say, retreated. Pushed back is honestly a better thing. They were not retreating, but they were forced back. For those unfamiliar with military terminology, there is a significant difference. Being forced back means you may be giving ground, but you are not outright running away. You are still engaging in conflict. Retreating is you have just full on run away. The fighting is over. Now, being pushed back to the city of Aizu, the forces loyal to the shogunate boarded themselves up in the castle. They were ready to withstand the siege. The siege here of Saruga Castle lasted around a month. There was skirmishing outside, but the siege itself, the what we refer to as the Battle of Aizu, which is the siege and the skirmishing around it collectively, lasted a few months, about 6 months. The siege itself was only around a month long. Again, we have the Toso, those exceptional cannoneers of the Imperial faction coming in and bashing down walls with their exceptional accuracy with those brand new, well designed Western cannons of theirs. Their highly disciplined training from the British Army. They were able to come in and no matter how much the samurai of Aizu in that castle wanted it to be different, they were not going to survive that. This also is the end of one of the at all. Certainly I've heard of the Shinsengumi. This is one of the final instances where the Shinsengumi ever shows up. The remnants of the Shinsengumi had retreated from Kyoto. Yes, they had actually retreated from Kyoto to Aizu. We also, in this, start seeing more of what is referred to as the Onamusha or Onabukesha female samurai. The term samurai is exclusively male. However, the terms in there are two, Onamusha and Onabukesha. The one that I use, Onabukesha, is quite literally female warrior or female samurai. We see them rise to the spotlight in this, in the Battle of Aizu. Two in particular, Nishima Ye and Akano Takako. Nishima Ye was a gunnery instructor. She was exceptional with a rifle. She would later on move from becoming a onabugeisha and a riflewoman to becoming one of the most well-known and recognized nurses during the First Sino-Japanese War, as well as in the Russo-Japanese War. She is an exceptional, or was an exceptional woman. I may do a history lesson on her and other onabugeisha throughout history. And then we have Nanako Takeko. She fought in the Battle of Aizu. She led an independent army made entirely up of women. This army included her family, her mother, and her sister. And while it was allowed, shall we say, for women occasionally to don the armor and march into battle, usually this only happened when their husband, who was the daimyo or was the head of the family, had died, and the exigent circumstances of war required the head of the family, who was the wife this on obligation to take the field. It was allowed. The men may not have liked it. The official stance may have been, this is not what women should do, but it was allowed. It was one of those, let us look the other way sort of things. Well, the Aizu did not want this to happen. They would not allow her and her forces to join their army, their defense. So, being the strong and amazing woman that she was, she said, no, fuck you, I will make my own army. And thus she did. And she proceeded to march into what was effectively a suicide charge with her army. Her army had no name at the time. It did eventually, after the fact, become rather, known as the Jochitai, which means women's army. They charged headlong into battle, killing scores of the enemy before they were all killed to the last woman. There was, after all of this, after everything on the mainland, there was a small holdout. So the very last holdout was on the island of Hokkaido, a place where the Tokugawa loyalists formed what they refer to as the Ezo Republic. This was the end of the Boshin War. The Ezo Republic was defeated in 1869, and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration began. If you recall, at the time, the call to battle for the Meiji, the imperialist faction, was Sono Joy. Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarian. Well, how does one revere the Emperor and dispel the barbarian? How does one do that and say they're doing that if they are using the weapons, the tools, the technology of the barbarian? Well, obviously, with the need to ensure that what happened to China, because everybody saw China, this massive nation with this gigantic army, was absolutely floored by an island nation a fraction of their size on the almost exact opposite end of the world. Everyone saw that and said, we need to ensure that does not happen to us. Every Asian nation did not want that to happen to them. Japan was no exception. So, what does one do to ensure that you can withstand the might of a Western power coming in? Well, just like the Tokugawa before them, the imperial court realized we cannot possibly withstand the Western powers if we do not modernize. So, Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, transformed from that into Okoku Kyohei, which means enrich well, depending on the translation, enrich the nation or enrich the emperor. One must remember the emperor is the nation. Strengthen the military, strengthen the army. This concept is exactly what it sounds like. We are going to take all of everything we can from the West and make it our own. A rapid, and I mean rapid, industrialization began. From the end of the Boshin War in 1869 to just after the turn of the century, around 1908, so around 39 to 40 years, is how long it took Japan to move from a feudal society to a industrialized nation. That level of speed is unheard of. Most nations would take upwards of 100 years to industrialize. Think about that. 100 years. Japan did that in less than half the time. Now, there are other instances of other nations doing that faster, as fast, but to move from a completely insulated, absolutely no outside contact nation to a major industrial player on the world stage in 39 to 40 years is something that effectively no other nation has ever been able to do, especially in that time period. It is easier now to do so. Technology is more portable. You're able to have more innovation transferred to more places because of compartmentalization of things. You can take things apart. You can manufacture things so much easier. This is a nation that made everything by hand that was now making everything in factories in under 40 years. We had a network of trains that went from everywhere. You could reach almost any destination in the country via train. And if you could not reach it via train, you could take that train to a port, and the port would take you to where you needed to go. So much easier. And with the increase in the ability to travel, the economy rose. With the rising economy, the standard of living increases. With the standard of living increase, the economy again will increase. Because if people are having more that they can purchase because their purchasing power has gone up, then they will tend to buy more, which will raise their standard of living. And by raising the standard of living, it makes it where business is able to have more capital to work with so they can innovate more, which further raises standards of living. It is all cyclical, it all works. And this all is due to the intervention of a guy who has the same name as a star of Friends coming in and celebrating the 4th of July on the 8th of July in Edo Bay. Well, that is all for today, class. I hope you all have learned something new. For those that were familiar with this, I hope that you have learned something that you may not have, or that you were reminded of things that you had forgotten. Have a wonderful rest of your day. and I will see you for our next class.